got to tell you, folks, there was a lot of good material you missed because of how things were. Welcome back to Sometimes We Do This, of course, the 6 p.m. pre-show live stream with a great guest. We've had on Mike Hanna, we've had on Nando Vila, and joining us for this expedition is Christo Aivalis. We've also, of course, had on David Dole. Christo Aivalis, who is a Canadian politics-focused YouTuber in a very historically minded, very analytically shrewd left channel on Canadian politics. As always, folks, while you're watching this, hit us with a super chat donation. Help everything go along. And welcome, Christo. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. So we actually did talk with our buddy David Dole from Rational National about the kind of contours of the election a couple of months ago. But you know, heading into the final stretch here, what's the sort of big picture? What's the state of play with the main, I guess, arguably four main parties here? We've also got like an alt-right party. What are things looking like in terms of the polls, in terms of the atmosphere?
Well, right now, Canada basically has five parties that can sort of win seats, plus an alt-right party that likely won't. You have the Liberals and Conservatives. Liberals are sort of center-right Democrats type thing. You got your Conservatives who are kind of centrist Republicans. Then you have the NDP, sort of a party of Bernie Sanders types. You have the Green Party, which is really ideologically eclectic. And then you also have the Bloc Québécois, which is traditionally at least a separatist party that only runs in Quebec. And the way it looks right now is that the Liberals and Conservatives are likely kind of going toe-to-toe for first place, although the Liberals have a bit of an advantage in terms of the distribution of their vote, much like in the United States. Where you get votes matters sometimes as much, if not more, than how many you get. And you have the NDP sort of running in third place right now. It looked for a while that the Greens might be catching them, but the Greens look to be falling back a little bit. The NDP is, of course, the traditional third party of the Canadian left.
Well, that's good news, at least from my perspective. I'm extremely skeptical of the Canadian Green Party, and in general, there's a very funny tendency, which we could look back to. I think actually globally, or at least in the European Union and potentially in Canada, you could look at it as sort of the failure of the '68 generation tracked through the Green Party. There's a way in which the sort of decoupling, which is more understandable at the time, given the situation in Europe, in the Soviet Union, obviously, but the sort of decoupling of eco-politics and self-actualization and social liberalism, which are all things that we support. But if you don't have it grounded in a materialist analysis and a class politics, that can be very easily repurposed for sort of, sunflower neoliberalism, which is what a lot of Green parties look like. And I mean, would you say that, and again, I know there's always some people who get triggered by everything, so I would say not all, and certainly not all Green politicians, but the most powerful Green parties in the world have certainly trended in that direction, like and even just in the story arc of Joschka Fischer in Germany. Does the Canadian Green Party kind of follow that model, and why is the NDP reasserting its strength here?
Well, I think for a few reasons. One, I should say that the Green Party in Canada is likely to the right of many European Green parties. I think I would agree broadly with you, but I think at least in some countries, the Greens in Europe have a lot of redeemable qualities.
Sure.
And
sure,
given,
sure,
but the Green Party in Canada actually has a lot of its infrastructural roots in conservatism. A lot of their earliest leaders came from people who worked with, Conservative Party, progressive conservatives, they called themselves at the time, leaders. And so they come out of that sort of movement. And I would agree because I think they have this progressive image. The branding is great, given that climate issues are now for the first time ever tier one election issues. But, for instance, there's been some real discussion from the Greens in Canada, much like with Andrew Yang in the United States. I think that's a good analog. Our Greens can be compared a lot to Andrew Yang. And talking about a basic income that would, for instance, roll out disability payments. So it's like, what kind of equity analysis is that? What kind of class analysis is that? Is that you have a basic income that might actually exacerbate inequality, or I think at the very least will like solidify it.
Right.
And there is no class analysis. And the NDP, which took a neoliberal turn like the rest of Canadian politics, but which I assert is starting to come out of that, never really lost this historical connection to the labor movement. And because of that, I think that it always at least had the potential to come back. The Greens in Canada, at least, I can't speak for Greens absolutely everywhere, have no functional connection in any way to the working class, organically or inorganically. And I think you're right that this is where this sunflower liberalism comes from.
What is Jagmeet Singh's leadership like? I remember a couple of years ago when he was elected as a leader of the NDP, and I'm always trying to mug up. I've learned a lot from Canadian politics watching your channel. People should really check it out. I didn't know very much about him. Obviously, I knew I supported the NDP. If I was a Canadian voter, I'm sure that's how I would vote. I appreciated the obvious significance of him as a Sikh and so on, and he had appealing leadership quality. Other people said, look, this guy's from the right of the party. The party already took a wrong turn under the previous leader, Tom Mulcair, and this is some good sort of, there's the kind of rebranding and image making, but policy-wise, not necessarily very good. What does it actually look like? Is he moving to the left? How has his leadership worked?
This is the most left-wing platform that's been offered by the federal party, and indeed any federal party, since the Cold War. And I can say that without any hesitation. Does it go far enough? I would say no. In the leadership election, I would personally say that out of the four candidates, he was the second most left-leaning. I supported Nikki Ashton, but she finished third. Singh, has a certain image that is based on the way he dresses and whatnot, unlike, say, Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, which have this everyman working appeal. Jagmeet Singh dresses very, very fancy, and I don't think we should necessarily denigrate that.
No, he's got great style. Absolutely.
Exactly.
I've looked at some of the GQ spreads, man. I'm trying to learn.
Yeah. No, for sure. So I think that in some ways people overlook the fact that he was talking about wealth taxes and capital gains tax increases and all these sorts of things, which are fundamentally important because, in Canada, sometimes the Liberal Party will say, look, we'll raise the upper class income tax bracket by 1 or 2 points. But that's really meaningless when, investors can, get half off discounts on their taxes, or when people can pass on obscene amounts of wealth. And we see the growing popularity of a wealth tax, and only the NDP is proposing that, and only under Jagmeet Singh. Again, in my lifetime, I was born in the late 80s, have we seen this? And this is on top of the fact that he's recommitting towards things like not only, defending our healthcare program, but, fixing the major gaps that Americans might not know of. In Canada, we do have a decent healthcare system, but I have to let you guys know that you can go to the doctor and get a prescription for free. But to fill that prescription, you better have workplace insurance or money, because you might go without the medicine. So your doctor is free, but then you have to cut your pills in half or, lose your electricity. And like 1 million Canadians a year are forced to make alternative decisions because they can't afford their medication. That would be the equivalent of 10 million Americans population-wise. And so Singh is pushing to the left on all of this, and I think it's extremely encouraging. And again, is it as far as I would go as somebody on the left wing of the party? Probably not. But is he inspiring people and taking popular positions? I think he is.
That's excellent. I mean, as far as what, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm curious about Jagmeet Singh's positions relative to what seems to be two sort of, I don't want to necessarily say third rail, but very significant issues internationally, but also specifically to Canada, and two issues that really undermine the complete, just utter vacuum that is the Justin Trudeau government. That this is the, woke brand government that sells weapons to Saudi Arabia, that's eager to, partner with Jair Bolsonaro and so on. And it seems and can discourse all of this nice rhetoric and this and that, but when it comes to actual policy, specifically on the politics of ecology and climate, and also specifically on Indigenous sovereignty, how willing is Jagmeet Singh to go and put himself up both in terms of Indigenous sovereignty and also in terms of the fact that, Canada is a petro state. How willing is he to kind of push aggressively on those areas as well?
Well, I think you make a good point, and I think you realize that even in the leftmost ranges of our discourse are these difficult discussions. I think Singh is much more willing to talk about a legitimate partnership with Indigenous people to really embody reconciliation. And so if you look at the NDP's New Deal for People, NDP, sort of our Green New Deal, almost every section has a specific subsection relating to the specific experiences and needs of Indigenous people. And I don't know if that's enough, frankly, but it's I think a real good faith effort. And there are as many as a dozen or more Indigenous people running for the NDP in this election in very winnable ridings, urban and rural, people who live in predominantly First Nations reserve communities, but also live in settler communities, who are running for the NDP, both because they like the message, but also because they feel betrayed by Justin Trudeau. And on fossil fuels, you're right, this is a challenge for the NDP, not only because the Canadian economy is very reliant on fossil fuels, even more than the United States as a percentage, but the fact is that provincial governments and the NDP, whether it's the recently defeated Alberta one, and to a much lesser extent, but still notable, the British Columbia NDP government, do involve certain fossil fuel extraction projects as part of their economy. And I think what Singh has done is I think he's taken a pretty good position. And I think on the whole, it's the best one. He's the only party offering something of a Green New Deal, which is like decarbonizing the economy while imbuing it with a sense of social justice. The two biggest factors being, one, a transition for workers in the working class, and two, including Indigenous people as partners in that project. Those are the two overarching concerns. And another one is, banning fossil fuel subsidies. So he's not ready to move necessarily to ban fracking, let's say. And some people are disappointed because of that. But to extract all government subsidies in those projects and to shift those either to social programs or to green energy. And further to that, he's looking at adjusting the way Canada calculates a carbon tax. Justin Trudeau has been seen as a hero of sorts internationally for creating a carbon tax. But what people don't often know is the biggest polluters are partially, if not in a majority sense, exempt from the carbon tax, and Singh would not make special exceptions for those industries. Now, again, does that go far enough? A lot of left environmentalists would say no, but I do think it is something that is palatable to the broad progressive electorate, and I think that it's still something that no other party is offering.
Is the shine off of Justin Trudeau?
Oh, certainly. Trudeau going into this year, with this time last year, 1 year out from the election, it wasn't. He was still very popular. He was looking like he was cruising to a majority. And then the SNC-Lavalin affair happened. He fired He fired an Indigenous female cabinet minister who rightly spoke up against his government's corruption and duplicity and corporate ties. And then that was followed by a high-profile resignation out of solidarity from another female cabinet minister. And ever since then, Trudeau's personal numbers have been, below in the negatives, if you will, and they haven't really recovered. Now, the polls do indicate that the Liberals have risen a little bit, and the way our system works, much like, your Congress in some ways, is, first past the post is what matters. And the Liberals and Conservatives both polling around in the low mid 30s. The Liberals could win absolute power with about 35% of the vote because they have a good vote lead in vote-rich Ontario. Our system is just as broken as your electoral college, maybe even more so.
When you look at NAFTA, let's, as a framework, it's very clear that if you have our kind of politics, that it was a deal that was, written by corporate special interests, and it's favored those corporate interests. It's had bad environmental effects everywhere. It's certainly cost a lot of jobs in the United States, maybe not as much as some people claim, but it has cost some jobs. It'd be delusional to deny that. And it's, I'm less clear of all of the effects on the Canadian economy, but I would imagine in some ways not a terribly different development. And in Mexico, there's been radical displacements and kind of primitive capital accumulation, and has also facilitated things like the shifting of some of the kind of epicenter of drug trafficking routes from Colombia to Mexico as the sort of like scaling of the sort of greatest violence of the kind of like U.S. operations against Colombian cartels in the 90s actually correlated with pushing this trade agreement. If we were to look at that and say, we under any left project want to scrap NAFTA, write something that is, humane, has high environmental standards, that's built on enhancing workers and cooperative worker powers across these boundaries. And then you look at Jagmeet Singh, AMLO, and Bernie Sanders. Can you, in your mind, start to kind of assemble from those three leaders in turn? Obviously AMLO is in power, so if you have any specific thoughts about him, we're going to be doing more on him later. But you have it, Jagmeet Singh's program incredibly well, and I know you follow Sanders. What would a sort of positive alternative for North American integration kind of look like to you as a Canadian leftist?
Yeah, I think one, just right off the top, I don't think the most important thing is even, what the governments will decide. I think honestly, it's greater working class solidarity. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that from the Canadians, the United Steelworkers here in Canada, the same United Steelworkers that represent the United States, the Canadian jurisdiction of it, has a fairly long-standing branch of solidarity with Los Mineros in Mexico. And Napoleon Gomez, who was exiled from Mexico as sort of a political exile, lived in Canada for many years and now has just recently gone back and is a senator. And so there's been a lot of ties there between the steelworkers on a continental basis. And I think that's crucial because you need to raise the standards of work, health and safety, environmental standards, not just through legislation, but through collective bargaining. And I have to say that it really hurts solidarity that when, for instance, the Oshawa GM plant was being closed here in Southern Ontario, the Unifor union, some of its leadership, which supports the Liberal Party, sad as it is, took an anti-Mexican line. But I'll tell you one thing, the biggest effect in recent years on the Canadian labor movement's ability to effectively bargain probably isn't Mexico. It's right-to-work states down south. It's Republican governors and Democratic governors, a form of Hillary Clinton's right-to-work supporting vice presidential nominee. America, more than Mexico, I would wager, has undercut Canadian labor standards. And I think you're right in noting that with Singh and Sanders and, the Mexican government really working together, they could, for example, push forward with policies that not only make trade more contingent on better generalized labor and environmental health and safety, gender equality standards, all of those important things, and actually mean it. But I think of, for instance, and this is something that I have not heard a lot about. Bernie Sanders wants to ban right to work nationwide. And if he succeeds without hyperbole, that might be a bigger deal than Medicare for all, honestly. If the right to work is the biggest scourge on American politics other than, racism since the Second World War. And if Bernie Sanders can ban right to work and combine that with a generalized pro-labor trade reform, because trade can be beneficial to the working class. Autarky isn't necessarily a good idea, but it has to be centered on class politics. And I think if Bernie Sanders can ban right to work and we can start from that platform, I could see a very, very, very special historical moment happen in the NAFTA region.
Final question. I mean, instead of asking you to make a prediction, although maybe a prediction question is contained in this, what's your kind of ideal scenario from what you see as being within the realm of the possible for this Canadian election cycle?
Well, it should be noted that, in 2011, Jack Layton, who's passed away, polled around where Jagmeet Singh is polling now and ended up doubling the vote in about 3 weeks. Wow. Literally anything is possible. But if I was to be a sober observer, my suggestion to all your Canadian viewers is that neither Justin Trudeau nor Andrew Scheer can have a majority government, which is to say they should not be given a sufficient amount of votes to control the entire parliament for 5 years, which is effectively a parliamentary dictatorship. The absolute goal is, wherever possible, elect NDP MPs, defeat Liberals and Conservatives to do so, because here in Canada, we celebrate Medicare. Tommy Douglas, the father of it. Our Bernie Sanders in some way. Prairie socialist preacher, has all this great history behind him. Medicare came to Canada in part because there was a Liberal government that required the NDP's support to keep power in the early mid-1960s. And I think that if we can give Jagmeet Singh and the NDP the balance of power this time, we could have dental care and pharmacare, and we could have maybe even proportional representation, which would actually give the left wing of the political spectrum seats in proportion to the amount of votes they get. I think that is a more than realistic scenario and wouldn't require a whole lot of work. But I would say, don't count Jagmeet Singh out. Anything can happen.
Well, we're here in all solidarity and all spirit. People, a couple of people have actually asked me this, so I would definitely vote for NDP and support Jagmeet Singh if I was in Canada, 100%. And I would also go over and subscribe and watch Christo Aivalis' YouTube channel if you're interested. I mean, certainly in Canadian politics, but the way that Christo does it, and this is what I like, is it's a materialist and historical analysis. So it will give you a deeper understanding of it's the case studies that give you the dynamics that can be applied to many industrial countries and this sort of broader left moment. So Christo, thanks a million for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Also, let you know, I do talk about Bernie Sanders now and then, much like you and David. Big Bernie backer here. If I was an American, man, the doors I'd be knocking on for Bernie.
Absolutely. We all got to knock. It's time to stop playing, get real, elect Bernie Sanders. Thank you so 100%. Much, Christo. Appreciate it.
Have a good one.
You too. All right, folks, we'll be back here in about 30-ish minutes.